what kind of trees that she might work with here.
What kind of trees there are.
Interesting.
Welcome to class today.
Thank you.
All right. How's your hands-on stuff going lately? Your other, update me what's happening with the rest of your.
Deep into the underneath muscles.
Oh, right.
We're
Diving
learning
some deep muscles.
To get to the not so pleasant portion of a massage. You know,
Okay.
More therapeutic.
A little bit more,
And not
yeah,
relaxing,
more clinical approaches.
Stuff to
Okay.
overcome chronic pain.
Mm-hmm.
You know, somebody comes in with a complaint and we can address it, but
Yeah.
it might not be pleasant.
Anything come up so far that's like really surprising in your, as you expand into more clinical practice?
I wasn't expecting to learn stuff that like hurt.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Sometimes it's not all the pleasant sensations. Yeah, yeah. Even with that though, right, we have the kind of opportunity to help people recalibrate the nervous system on how we identify pain and to be able to like learn how to accept sensations that are not destructive, but maybe so unaccustomed that just like the novelty of getting poked down into the psoas or whatever is like kind of agitating, right? Yeah. Learning how to balance that.
Getting under the pec minor from this.
Oh yeah,
a lot of,
that's a
like
sensitive one.
That we're
Yeah.
training on. So that's nice. I didn't think we'd get that far into like the QL we did yesterday.
Nice.
That hurt.
All right.
All of us.
Okay, so everybody really needed the QL stuff.
Three of us have a complaint with the low back.
Okay.
And it was very therapeutic for all of us.
Okay, so we've got some resetting going on in those different zones.
The stretching that we're learning, like the bracing the back and like taking that.
Yeah, stretching. Cool. Today I want to definitely get into a little bit of, as we're closing in on our official phase 1 bookwork segment, let's talk about the licensing exam, and I want to do some kind of practice questions with you guys. I'm going to actually close the door and then we'll settle in. Okay. So go ahead and find your comfortable position. Start taking some deep breaths. Yeah. Get in that pattern. How's that feeling as you tune into, with all this practice, finding that sensation in your toes and your bottoms of your feet, and kind of waving that energetic awareness? Do you find that easier than it was when we first started?
Yeah, I'm less worried about making mistakes since it just feels more open.
Yeah, more practice, more comfortable. Okay. Okay, I want you to begin to picture what you have done so far in your study methods. And then just pull up, what is the image that you currently have of when you go to sit for the exam, when your training is technically complete and it's time to show what you know? What sensations does that bring into the body? Just notice them, hold them. If it's starting to become easier access for you, maybe even notice which chakra level those sensations might be sitting at. And picture yourself beginning the test, how that feels with your current mental framework. Picture yourself mentally engaging with the questions, selecting out your options. Accessing all the information that you've pulled into your mind and that you've written into your body. And then see for yourself the moment that you decide you are finished, that you've done your best on the exam and it's complete. And you turn it in. And the window of time waiting to get the results. And then see yourself realizing as you receive the results that you have passed and that you are ready to submit everything into the state board, that you're about to get the full stamp of approval and open up your future as a professional massage therapist, that you've done all of the steps and achieved your goal. And pull in that gratitude. Pull in that love. And return to the room, return to the surface of your skin. Become aware of what's around you again. Okay. So what do you guys know already about the examination?
Well, I've taken a couple of questions, free online questions.
Awesome.
And it's not that hard.
Yeah, it's not that hard. Yes.
Some of them are really obviously not the right answer.
Mm-hmm.
It's kind of common sense in a way.
Yeah, using common sense, using that multiple choice approach, you can see yourself figuring out how to work through them. Okay.
100 questions?
100 questions. Yes, there are 100 questions on the Hawaii State exam. The Hawaii exam was developed just for here. We're the only state that takes exactly this examination. And it has recently transitioned into being available as like a digital exam. So that's kind of exciting. You guys will be in the first wave of students that are getting access to that all online examination process. And they'll have all the instructions for you. The proctoring is kind of interesting. They have a procedure where they have you show the space that you're in order to kind of reduce potential of cheating, of course. But it's somewhat even more casual than when I took the exam. So that's kind of exciting. You guys have a chance to play through it that way, and I'll be super interested to hear about your experiences as you complete them. But we are expecting them to use largely the same set of questions that was set up for the paper, more formally proctored examination system. And so I want to just go through a few of these and kind of practice the cognitive process of how we look at these multiple choice questions and narrow down our options and eliminate. I know we did a few of them at the very beginning, but let's pull some of these out and just kind of discuss how we would go about taking these classes or taking these questions. Okay, so here's the question. Which are not functions of the skeletal system? I think it's always great if you can kind of conceive of what answer you would give before even reading the rest of the suggested answers. Because if you already know, right? But we can use the suggested answers to narrow it down. So, which are not functions of the skeletal system? Okay, support, posture, mineral storage, or hemopoiesis.
Whatever that is.
How do you spell that?
Hemopoiesis is Hemopoises.
Sounds like a blood thing.
Mm-hmm.
Hemo is blood.
Mm-hmm.
But bone has bone marrow produces blood.
Good catch.
What was the third one?
Okay, so we have A, support, B, posture, C, mineral storage, D, hemopoiesis.
Mineral storage sounds more like skeletal system than hemopoiesis, which sounds like a disorder.
Mm-hmm.
So, which wouldn't necessarily affect
Interesting.
everyone. So
All right.
D.
Okay, so Eva's going with D.
Well, I'm a little bit vacillating on the posture thing because that's muscular.
Ah.
Posture's muscular. Right. But if you have like a herniated disc, that would be cartilage in between your bone, and that might be your that's your vertebral column. So posture in your vertebrae exists, right? On a structural bone level.
All right.
So second one is support.
First one is support. B is posture. C, mineral storage. D, hemopoiesis.
A function of the skeletal system.
Which are not functions of the skeletal system.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, not knowing what the blood thing is, hemopoiesis,
Mm-hmm.
I think I might guess D.
Okay. So that's where we're at.
Mineral storage, though?
All those
Calcium?
minerals in the calcium and the thing and the thing and the
Where's my markers?
Oasis. What is another thing with basis in it?
Okay. I'm going to actually give this to you.
Moving on.
The answer is posture. Is not a function of the skeletal system. This is technically a job of the muscles, and while bones, of course, can be impacted by posture, or problems with bones can be seen in the posture, the action of maintaining posture is happening on a muscular level. So support, obviously nobody really tried too hard on, like, support sounds like bones, right? Mineral storage, calcium especially, but also some of our other electrolytes are being like deposited and released from the skeleton all the time. And it's actually a huge part of how we regulate the levels of calcium in our blood. And so mineral storage is a function of the skeletal system. I'm going to write out hemopoiesis. Hemopoiesis.
That's the function of making blood?
Yes. Hemo is blood. Poiesis, this is the same as poem. The origination, the generation, the kind of creative process of blood. So that's a sweet one. But that's a tricky word, right? Okay, so we're getting warmed up on what the brain has to do to make these kind of jumps, and hopefully you'll have really internalized a lot of the vocabulary that you need in order to pull this apart, but you will perhaps see some words that you're just blanking on, or you don't remember the context of that, or like maybe somehow we skipped it. And so being able to triangulate what your options might still be out of that is really key to the examination process. Okay, so our next question, the primary function of muscles are,
Posture.
here we go, yep, so we can expect that, then this is going to be a little bit of a tricky question, especially to do via audio here because it is a list. So primary functions of the muscles are heat production, support, and movement. B, movement, posture, and support. C, support, movement, exercise. D, heat production, movement, posture.
Same, what is it not?
This is primary functions of the muscles. Yeah.
Okay.
Well, I'm gonna guess D because heat production, I mean, you move and you're gonna generate heat.
We're going to generate heat.
You're gonna
Using
have
the muscles.
posture because you carry yourself a certain way. And movement, I mean, that's the primary thing muscles do is they move the body.
Okay.
I'm guessing D.
All right. So the terms that we saw in some of the other question or the other suggested answers besides D, A, we have heat production, support, and movement. B, we have movement, posture, and support. C, we have support, movement, and exercise.
Well, maybe.
How do you guys
movement,
feel
posture,
about
and
that?
support sounds better than heat.
Yeah, I
Movement,
think,
posture, and support.
I think B, I mean, exercise doesn't sound right to me, even though you do use your muscles to exercise.
Movement
Support,
is,
movement and
that
posture.
includes that. Posture, definitely. Support, that's bones.
You feeling like they're tricking you?
Yeah. that's tricky.
Maybe they're playing with us right now.
What was A again?
A was heat production, support, and movement.
Production. It does, the muscles produce heat or does blood produce heat though, right?
Well, what does heat come from?
Well, friction
Yep.
and
Heat can be produced by
oxygen.
friction. Oxygen, is it just oxygen is present so things get warmer? Or what's the mechanism there?
Oh, well, I know that you have to have, in order to make heat, you have to have, well, it seems to me oxygen is what feeds the fire. Friction is what gets it going. Isn't there three things?
Fire. I'm going to just capture that. Fire.
So you have to have some nerve energy, synapses going
Okay.
in order to, that's fire, that's the electrical stimulation or whatever.
Definitely is a piece of getting it snapped into action so that the muscles are doing the action, the movement, right? Mm-hmm.
So that's,
Thinking it through.
read the question again?
Okay. Primary functions of the muscles are heat production, support, movement. B, movement, posture, support. C, support, movement, exercise. D, heat production, movement, and posture. But you're on track here. This idea of fire, which inside the body we'll also call metabolism.
Oh. Yes.
Right? And we do need oxygen. This is a huge part of why we're constantly breathing, because we need oxygen in order to do the internal fire, to feed that engine. But we also need fuel. And in fire, generally, the three components are oxygen, fuel, and heat. And this will sound a little bit funny because like the fire is making the heat, but if you can basically get the fuel and oxygen cold enough, a fire will be interrupted, right? And so that's actually, although we may think of it as we're interrupting the oxygen when we throw water on a fire, the biggest impact is how fast it cools down the molecules that are being metabolized and broken apart. So fire ultimately is literally where we have particles that are breaking. And so the energy that's released as like a molecule gets fragmented, it was energy that was holding it together. And so when we disrupt the relationship between the components of a given molecule, then the energy that was interlocking and holding the atomic structure together is popped open. And so that's where we're getting light and heat, is the waves of energy coming off of the release of that relationship as it ends, essentially.
So what it sounds like is that primary function of muscles includes heat, because otherwise we'll just die, because if we just lay there, there will be no heat.
Yes.
So,
Yeah.
so it's got to be the one that doesn't include heat.
No, it doesn't. Because
Well,
it's asking.
The primary functions of the muscles are.
What is the primary function? So the answer has to include heat. So it's not the one that doesn't say heat.
So it's, I think it's the first one you said, which was like posture, heat, and
Movement.
Right. So we want heat production, movement, and posture.
Yeah, let's try that one.
All right, nicely done.
wasn't
Nicely
even
done.
something a particle in a cell? Is a
Oh,
particle just
great question.
anything?
Yeah, so a particle is, we can count any like single atom, like anything that would make it onto the table of elements, right? But also molecules, which are groupings of atoms that are bonded together. And inside of, okay, so if you have like some atoms, they can individually be a particle. If they're bonded together, they can be a particle together. But a cell, comparatively, is like a whole ass complicated system that's like another, like, you know, crazy amount of atoms and molecules that are all like super complexly interlaced to build that up, because the cell is alive unto itself, right? It's a whole life form that is going through the process of metabolism and reproduction, and it has a cytoskeleton. Like, all of the different functions of the systems of your body are represented in miniature inside of a cell, and there's components for that. And so that's like super, super elaborate comparatively.
Are the protons and electrons?
That's all the way down to atomic. Yeah, you could call them atomic particles. And so then protons and electrons are like, you've got that, the atomic core, right? And then the electrons are going around the outside. And so any of those individually could be particles. So particle is just kind of like, it's a little bit more fancy way of saying like part, right? And so it's our tiny part. But a cell is basically a being. Yeah.
Organism.
It's a, yeah.
Okay, give us another one.
Okay, let's go. All right, abduction is A, extension in the coronal plane, B, flexion in the sagittal plane, C, flexion of the coronal plane, D, extension of the sagittal plane.
So sagittal is straight down, coronal is frontal, so abduction would be coronal. Did it say extension or flexion?
Abduction is A, extension of the coronal plane, B, flexion of the sagittal plane, C, flexion of the coronal plane, D, extension of the sagittal plane.
That's weird, because this flexion and extension go down the sagittal plane, so it is the coronal plane.
Yeah.
So extension of the coronal plane is my answer.
Extension of the coronal plane. Everyone happy with that?
Yeah, that makes sense.
Excellent. And you
Yeah.
worked that straight through, Eva. Nicely done. Yeah. Yep. So if we're moving outward, you were able to recall the angle, right? That you picked up the image of what is the movement of abduction, right? And so if you're abducting, you narrowed it down to this is happening in the corona, the coronal plane, and the movement away should be the extension of that angle of the joint,
It's not this.
right?
It's this.
It could, abduction could be, that would count as a form of abduction.
That's where that question
Exactly. That question.
is that lateral abduction? or-
Uh-huh. Good.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
That's just regular
Lateral
abduction.
abduction.
But I
Mhm.
would never call, this isn't called extension, right? This
It's-
is extension of the shoulder. This is like creating an angle.
Right. But that's the difference between abduction is the concept of moving away from the midline versus adduction coming towards the midline.
Okay.
But flexion and extension is a concept that's about the angle of the joint.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah.
Got it.
Yep. Nice.
Okay.
Okay. Let's see. Glands that secrete their products into ducts are called blank glands. A. Exocrine. B. Endocrine. C. Functional. D. None of the above.
Exo means putting out, endo means keeping within. And I don't think it's C, and I don't think it's D, so I'm gonna say exocrine.
How do y'all feel about that?
Well, that makes sense. But what is C again?
C is functional.
Functional.
Well, it is doing something. It's functioning,
Mm-hmm.
but is that correct answer?
I'll read the question one more time, just in case there's an extra clue in there. Glands that secrete their products into ducts are called blank glands. What else could a gland do?
Well, it could secrete their their product into a baby, because a mammary gland doesn't go into a duct, it goes into the baby.
Actually, technically, it does go through the milk ducts,
Oh, okay.
through the nipple.
So it
Yeah.
does feed the ducts.
Uh-huh.
Feed the bees.
Feed the ducks.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so what are glands? So you got your sweat glands.
Uh-huh.
Are there sweat ducts? There's not sweat ducts.
Are there sweat ducts? Anybody remember?
I think there are, because I think duct is just a word for like the way in which it travels.
Yeah, it's like same as if you think of a duct that you could actually see in a building or whatever.
Like an air duct.
It's exactly like a hollow passageway for air or what have you.
I mean, some hormones just exist within the gland and they don't get secreted, right? So,
Why would they do that?
Yeah, why would they stay in the gland?
I don't know, but I know that would probably be called an endocrine thing.
Okay.
Just 'cause I know
That's a
that
good
endo
guess.
means-
We've got these endo-exo contrast here. Okay. So I'll give this to you. This is, I think what you're kind of reaching for is the idea of some hormones are produced and they don't go into a duct. So they don't stay in the gland, but they just diffuse out of the gland. So like the ovaries are a great case of this, where they're just like gonna pop off some progesterone, some oxytocin, etc. And they're just like shooting it out into the interstitial space.
System or whatever.
Right.
So it's
Versus,
not a duct for that.
right, versus those eccrine glands in the skin that have a duct to the surface of the skin. Does that make sense?
Mhm.
Okay, so that was exocrine, which was Eva's first guess that she hazarded anyway, so that's great. All right. Moving into the next one, glands that secrete their products into the bloodstream are A, exocrine, B, endocrine, C, functional, D, none of the above. Mhm.
Glands that secrete into the blood. So that would be,
Like the kidneys. and the
endocrine was
kidneys.
one of the answers?
Exocrine, endocrine, functional, and none of the above.
Saying either functional or endocrine. Endocrine is endo. You said that, what does that mean?
Endo means inside.
Inside.
I'm gonna say functional, even though I think it could be none of the above.
Yeah.
If it's related to blood, it might have more of a blood vocab to it.
Bloody veins.
Yeah, go to 9.
So you're kind of leaning into a guess of that the blood is specific.
I'm leaning into functional because, like, if it's coming from different glands and many different glands have this ability, then
Mhm.
you wouldn't define it as endocrine. It's traveling, but it's functional. It kind of encapsulates the idea of a lot of different things are happening from the gland secreting into the blood.
I
So I'm
see
gonna
your
say
logic there.
C.
Okay. So Eva's going with C. Yuka, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I agree with the explanation by Eva. But,
Okay. We are going to call those endocrine glands.
Endocrine
Yes. That it's the definition of the endocrine versus exocrine gland is whether it specifically has a duct to carry the contents, the hormonal serum, what have you, to a specific location. And so if it's not going to a specific location where it's getting used up via that duct, then it's ultimately ending up in the bloodstream. Whether it goes into the interstitial fluid, gets picked up by the lymph and returned to the bloodstream, or is actually emitted straight into the blood by the way that that particular gland is structured. Okay?
Well,
All right.
I'm not doing well on this test so far. Something I know.
All right.
Wait, just so I have it.
Yes.
It does have a duct that carries to a specific location and ends
Exocrine.
up in that's exo. So it
Yep.
does not have a duct.
Yes, if it is equipped with a duct, it is exocrine. If there is no duct involved, this is endocrine. Okay, great. All right, let's do this last one. The primary function of red blood cells is, see if you can grab it in your
I'm
mind.
thinking oxygen.
Oxygen's coming up, okay.
The
So,
primary function of red blood cells.
It's not to fight immune. That's leukocytes.
No.
It's to carry oxygen to the blood.
all right.
To the tissues, right? To your muscles and your.
The iron does that.
Let's hear the options.
Oh, there's options.
A, defense against microbes.
No.
B, transport of gases. C,
Options again.
blood clotting.
No.
D, to produce plasma.
B.
No. Yeah, we're all in agreement that it's about gases.
It's about gases. Excellent. Well done. Very good. Okay, so that's like a very modest sample of starting to get a taste for how the questions work, what range of topics you can expect to see. We were in a segment there that was really heavy on more like broad anatomical, like physiology. Physiology being the like functional application, right? The anatomy technically is the naming of pieces of the body and defining like what counts as this piece of the body. Physiology being what each piece of the body is actually doing and why. Okay? So those were a little bit more physiological oriented questions. You'll also see pretty solid, like maybe 10% of questions that relate to like state law about your practice specifically. So that is important and worth being quite familiar with. And it'll go back and forth on some of those more anatomical terminology things versus the kind of being able to intuit or to reinterpret for the benefit of the question what is actually happening in the body, what's the function of the body for that stuff. Okay? All right. Let's slide away from that for now, and we'll keep kind of revisiting some of those questions over the next few weeks. We really just have like 2 more weeks, right?
Mm-hmm.
Is that accurate?
Yes.
Wow.
Our last class is something like the 14th.
We are closing in. Can't believe it. It always feels like, let me know if this matches your experience, but it always seems to me that it feels like very long at the very beginning, that when you're looking ahead to the whole arc of the study and you're like, oh my Lord, we're going to see so many topics and it's going to take forever, and you know, it feels far away, the end point of the study. But then as you close in on it, it's like, wow, this is like not a lot of time to actually digest all this material, right?
Yeah, so that means we have 3 more sessions together.
I believe so. Did we miss one? We'll balance this all
I
out
don't remember
regardless.
missing anything.
But yeah, I don't think that we did have any that we skipped this time. So I want to pull us into some of our, let's just go straight to our impact on the system. So we talked a lot about like functional mobility, the stress management kind of stuff last time. And sort of translating the practical application of like, why do we see these impacts? So let's go ahead and play with this nervous system and neuroendocrine impacts of massage specifically. We'll talk about that. Okay, so do you guys remember talking about the CNS and ANS?
The central nervous system.
All right, remind me what we already know.
Central is more has to do with pain reception and the overall sensory experience of the body.
Okay, we've got some pain, sensory. What are the structures of these 2 systems?
The spinal column.
Yeah, spinal cord.
Yeah, the spinal cord and the brain.
Spinal cord and brain. So where's the rest of the autonomic nervous system?
The nerves.
The nerves.
Go all the way out to your ends of your body.
And what do we call those nerves?
Oh, they're called
Yes. Peripheral.
Peripheral.
Peripheral nerves. Okay? Peripheral nerves. So, yes, pain and sensory information is processing in the brain and in the spinal cord, but it's largely picking up in the peripheral nerves, yeah? Okay? All right, so we've got that distinction between those 2. So the central nervous system and the autonomic nervous system both have responses to massage that are pretty distinct and pretty well understood. So when we do manipulative therapy, such as massage, this results in the discharge of muscle spindle afferents. Does that make sense to you when I say that?
no.
Let's go back to what is a muscle spindle. Okay, so we have a muscle, we have the body of the muscle, the belly of the muscle, we've got our tendons that are going to come out and do our attachment process, right? And we've got our innervation coming down into the motor end plates to operate the muscles, right? So at the motor end plates, we're going to have the instructions from the motor nerves. And then the nervous system is also going to measure what actually happens with muscle spindle cells. So an individual muscle fiber actually can be running through a spindle. And so this structure of the muscle spindle cell is able to pick up, because it's like a slinky, right? And so if this muscle cell is extended to its full length and is really stretched out, then it's going to have no contact between the different loops of the spindle. When the muscle is contracted, then it'll be collapsed down like a slinky, and so you'll get that electrical connection points where the nervous system can read how flexed or extended the muscle actually is in space based on the muscle spindle cell. So this is super useful when in cases where maybe you tell your body what to do and either your coordination is not all the way dialed in, or maybe you're in resistance to something, and so you're giving a stronger instruction than the actual movement you're getting out of the muscle tissue. Does that make sense? And so it's the muscle spindle cell that is going to tell the nervous system that that's happening. So the signal from the muscle spindle cell is connecting into that afferent register of the nerves. Okay? Yeah. AFF, afferents. And then the opposite of that would be efferent when it's going the other direction. Okay? So when we are doing massage, we're operating those muscle spindle cells in a mechanical way. We're actually manually lengthening them out. We're manually lengthening out the tissue of the muscle itself and allowing it to stretch. And you've gotten better and better at picking that up in your hands-on practice, right? Where you can feel when you get that like little bit of a drop open inside the muscles, and you know that like you've accomplished something there, that it goes from tight to a little bit less tight. Yeah, starting to like really feel that. So we're operating on that. The Golgi tendon organs are another kind of similar concept, that it's a way that the nervous system is listening into the actual positioning of the tendons. And then we've got mechanoreceptors. And you don't have to memorize all these terms, but our high threshold mechanoreceptors, low threshold mechanoreceptors, cutaneous, muscular, and articular receptors. So these are giving us cutaneous would be the skin, muscular would be in the muscles, articular would be in the joints, yeah? So all of these are producing information that's going into the nervous system about where the body actually is in space. And anything that we're doing to somebody's body is going to activate a bunch of these receptors and start feeding a lot more information into the nervous system. Does that make sense?
What does Golgi mean?
Golgi is just a guy. It's just an anatomist that named a bunch of things that he
named a bunch of things, right?
He named a bunch of things after himself. Yep.
I see Golgi in so many quizzes, and it always feels like there's something different. So it's really confused me.
Yes.
It makes sense that
A rather prolific anatomist. Great question. Anatomists get to name things. Some of them try to make it easy on us, and some of them just love the fame. I don't know. If you wanted fame, becoming an anatomist feels like the least direct route, but cool.
Someone named the island that they discovered Amelia Earhart's plane on Powland. Like, Powland?
Whoa.
Yeah, it was probably just a guy, but.
That's silly.
Yep.
Okay.
Fun fact.
So we're going to impact all of that, and all of these like neurophysiological effects, which I'm just kind of saying that word so you can hear it, neurophysiological effects, right? You already understand it. Now you've heard it said out loud. Of these mechanical stimuli are, they're going to call it renormalizing the neural or sensory input especially after an injury. Because when we take an injury, then we have to do these like protective behaviors to support the movement that's going to cause more pain or damage if we don't adjust the way that we maneuver our bodies through space, the way that we take the impact of gravity or weight from things that we're lifting, et cetera, right? And so that actually really rapidly rewires the nervous system when we accommodate a body structure that's non-standard because of an injury. And that's a huge part of what we're doing when we revisit those zones and we support that area and basically just give it the feedback as it's returning to normal to help it progressively restabilize and re-coordinate to accept the body in a neutral, supported position in space. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. That is a really big piece of our effect of massage on the nervous system so far as we currently really can understand that from a research perspective. And then that same information is going to feed into the sensory motor cortical areas of the brain. And so the part of the brain that has a relationship with those direct components of the sensory system in the peripheral nervous system also has to kind of mirror that experience of wiring, rewiring, wiring, rewiring to adapt to like reality as we experience it. And this is super fast. Like what's really truly amazing about the nervous system and the adaptability of the human body generally is how fast and effective it can be. That like we're familiar with the idea of, say, trauma. When something happens and it changes the way that your nervous system pathway is going to operate to like avoid that kind of damage again. And it can be really substantial. It can be like huge behavioral impacts, huge structural impacts ultimately. It can last for a long time. And it can happen so fast. But the positive things that we do in adding coordination, it is gradual in the sense that we do small units of it at a time, but the wiring of the neurons actually forming those synapses and coming into relationship, organizing themselves, and starting that chemical communication across the neuronal gap is instantaneous. So it takes maybe thousands of repetitions of it to have a stable enough structure that that information can all reliably travel and like pattern together. But every time that we're learning, when you get that little like click, like that's probably dozens of them happening at once. There's like subtler experiences that we would hardly be able to register of like an individual synapse forming. Some people are quite sensitive to it though. And it feels good, right? Do you get that like sense of like you like when you understand something all of a sudden, or when you like try something that you weren't quite coordinated enough to do before, but then it works the next time? What's going on in that synaptic gap?
The connections are forming.
Yeah.
They're learning about each other.
They're learning about each other. They're building a relationship, and who is going back and forth? Because this is a sort of an interstitial space, right? Where they're positioned, they hang out there, but there's just kind of juice flowing between them, and then the receptor ready to pick up the chemical that's released. Yeah.
Neurons?
From one neuron into the next,
Oh, what's in there?
going across. Yeah.
The synapses are
Yeah. They're going to communicate with neurotransmitters. Neurotransmitters, that's what it's talking across. These are our particles. And remember, the neurotransmitters are more or less the same group of chemicals that we'll also call hormones when they're landing on other receptors of other cells throughout the body, when it's not synaptic, but it's communicating on the surface of other cells, right? So the big one that and this is like super, super cool when you learn how to actually feel the sensation and kind of like amplify it, is dopamine. Dopamine is what tells one neuron that it just found its friend, like that we're going to stick together. When they start sending dopamine back and forth across that synaptic channel, now they're connected. And the more they feed back and forth across it, the more effectively that neural pathway is going to sustain over time. What else does dopamine do?
It makes you feel good?
It makes you feel good. It specifically makes you feel like it's worth it. Dopamine is the reward chemical. It's the signal that we get of what we have accomplished should be repeated. We did the right thing. And it is a super important component of self-motivation, of the capacity to direct your own behavior. People who are really low dopamine, where we see these like low dopamine, low serotonin, that's depression, where we stop being able to effectively drive our own behavior when the whole system is too low. But this is happening on a teeny tiny like micro level in the actual synaptic space as they're forming the neurons. And so like in more extreme cases of depression, or if you've had experiences of like really low windows in life, maybe you can recall these moments where you want to do something and it's like you can't make yourself, where it's like, I just can't get out of bed. I just can't stop like one behavior and move on to the next behavior, or I can't activate a behavior at all. This is a dopamine flatline experience.
So when you visualize yourself doing the thing that you've been having resistance to doing,
Right.
it makes it possible for you to do it because you've created the synapse.
Exactly. That you're literally letting your imagination construct the synaptic pathway ahead of the action. And so you'll get more ease on that action, because standing there when you're having to coordinate your muscular decision, maybe your like social positioning decision, maybe your economic decisions, maybe like all these different factors, like how hydrated you are, all these different pieces coming into play, then directing enough dopamine to get across that connection can be really challenging. But rehearsing it in a meditative state when you don't have all of those other competing influences on how your behavior is going to get selected out can allow you to actually have a lot more functional willpower. So that's super smart to take note of that, take use of that. And just to further put that a little bit more into context, dopamine is also really the main chemical that it comes down to when we look at addiction. That any of the major addictive chemicals that we really struggle with as a society are either going to inhibit pain, which is going to put it in like the morphine class chemicals, right? So opioids are a huge concern. Or they're going to do something in your system that allows you to access and release faster transmission of mainly dopamine. Often serotonin will kind of come into play. But it's when you really get that like addictive effect in a person, that sense of like drive to go back to repeat the behavior that's associated with the feeling of the chemical dropping into their system. It's the dopamine that drives the behavior of addiction. And we can have an addictive relationship with our own endogenous dopamine as well. And that's when on the total other side, from, you know, you have this like depressive state where you're not activating dopamine very effectively, but the other end of that being like workaholism or like frenetic kind of exhausting outpouring of energy that's unbalanced or like not directed well, because it's the experience of hitting the dopamine inside that's keeping them active instead of like the decisions of what to do individually. Does that make sense? Okay. So we revisited dopamine. That's a fun one. Let's cruise on through some of these other neuroendocrine substances or neurotransmitters. Serotonin. Do we remember what's going on with serotonin?
Isn't that the one that helps you get a good night's sleep? Melatonin. Yeah.
Melatonin is involved in sleep regulation, yeah.
Serotonin is that the love hormone thing where you feel all lovey-dovey?
I think you're reaching for oxytocin. We'll hit that too in a moment. Yeah.
Serotonin.
Yeah. Serotonin.
Somebody else guess, because I've already answered wrong twice.
Serotonin, we will often associate with like the happy chemical, like the more generic sense of happiness, whereas oxytocin, we have that like love and attachment effect associated with it. Serotonin being more general sense of like positivity or satiety. And so it's when we hit a certain level of serotonin that we feel like I have enough. I've eaten enough. I've accomplished enough of this activity. It allows us to regulate our behavior to be appropriate to the situation. So people who have like a serotonin crash kind of happening where they're unregulated on serotonin specifically will tend to like just seem weird, like just be more like behaviorally erratic, whether or not it's a problem. They'll just do stuff that is like not that dialed in reading the room, perhaps you could say, you know. And it is really important in the ability to regulate urges. So we have the impulses that are more a dopamine-driven system. The ability to select which urges or impulses are going to effectively apply to our situation is mediated with serotonin. An interesting effect also is when we look at like the physiology of being in love, when people are in that early cycle of attachment and that kind of like chemistry is elevated and you like really just that sense of drive to see the person, the sense of like not exactly being able to get enough. This looks like on a like neuroendocrine level, it looks like a huge surge of dopamine, a pretty substantial surge of oxytocin, and a dropout of serotonin.
Interesting.
Yeah, super fascinating.
You're less happy and you're just more like.
Well, you're not satisfied.
Yes,
Oh,
you're not quite getting enough, hitting that like satiety.
Right.
Like, and so it creates that sense of like driving you back into connection with the target of your affection. And this is a fundamental aspect of attachment in humans and like in primates generally, that like we want to create lasting, stable partnerships or relationships within our community subset. This obviously can vary a lot between individuals, but when we look at like the classical literature of like romantic attachment, you see this pattern over and over and over again, and you're like, that makes total sense based on the molecules happening in their brain once that kind of decodes, right? All right, another big set that we want to hit up against is that epinephrine, adrenaline, norepinephrine, noradrenaline set again. And so these are, you need to be able to recognize all these terms, but you don't necessarily need to be able to like distinguish them substantially. They're a class of chemicals that are all contributing to the same modulation, which is activating arousal mechanisms in the body. And so the epinephrine specifically is going to be more applied to the body, norepinephrine system, more happening in the brain. So again, this is kind of one of those groups where the chemistry can have kind of different names depending on whether it's inside the blood-brain barrier or outside that barrier.
So adrenaline is outside and epinephrine is inside the brain.
The epinephrine is what we'll call it when we find it in the body. Norepinephrine, we'll call it in the brain. Mm-hmm. and then that corresponds to epinephrine and adrenaline will usually handle as the same thing. So noradrenaline, you may sometimes see, that's a little bit like archaic sounding to me for some reason. But all of these chemicals are involved in modulating arousal activation, like amplifying the state of the nervous system, right? So adrenaline, we've got a pretty strong association with already of like you just get that kind of like punch to the kidneys, like amplification of whatever energy level you were at suddenly goes to bigger, and you're going to see like dilation of the pupils, you're going to see blood flow to the extremities increase pretty substantially, and heart rate increase, these like different components that are going to tend to make us more prepared to respond to an external threat. And then we want to talk also about the endorphins. And there are a few other terms that you may hear thrown around with the endorphin system. That'll be the enkephalins and the dynorphins. These are the entire class together is what we would call the endogenous opiates. So they're going to have the effect of lifting the mood and supporting satiety, but especially modulation of pain. They're going to bring down our nociception impact so that we're having less actual sensation of pain and also less emotional reactivity to the experience of pain.
Endogenous what?
Endogenous opiates. Yep. Or endogenous morphine, you'll sometimes say. Yes, exactly. It means we make it ourselves. It's created inside of the cells of the body and released amongst themselves. Okay? All of these chemicals that we're talking about so far, we can also talk about endocannabinoids. And that's pretty obvious. They're the also endogenous chemicals that correspond to cannabis-like chemistry. We'll get that THC, CBD kind of correlatives. Those are neuromodulatory chemicals, and they're involved in a lot of physiological processes, including pain sensation, mood, memory, motor coordination, blood pressure. That's why cannabis can have an impact on blood pressure concerns, and especially early on when it was a lot more difficult to get like a green card prescription, like blood pressure issues were one of the more direct ways to access that. And of course, the effects of cannabis chemistry have an impact on us because our bodies already have receptors for those molecules. And we also make those molecules and we use them in a little different, like subtler way, but we can respond to cannabis because we already have reception for endocannabinoids built into the body. Oxytocin, we've talked about a fair amount, woven that in and out, but that's that pair bonding hormone that comes out when we're really needing to connect with our children, our partners, our community members, general feeling of attachment and caretaking. And it's also a lot more directly related to some of the specific maternal processes of birth, delivery, lactation, in addition to being like really the heavy lifter in orgasm. And oxytocin obviously has some really positive impacts on our sense of well-being generally, that like long windows of time with really low oxytocin registration will tend to get that like lonely to the point of illness sensation, right? That can like wake you up at night and like really trigger some like cortisol cascades as well, to be too low on oxytocin. And that's a way that our like highly specialized community-oriented primate bodies drive us back into connection and attachment with our communities. Cortisol and glucocorticoids are stress hormones. They're also coming off the adrenal glands during prolonged stress. And so the contrast there that you would want to remember between cortisol and adrenaline is that adrenaline is a pretty fast-acting, quick impact situation, and cortisol will kind of adjust your threshold and stay in your system for quite a bit longer on average. And we can build up to, if we just kind of essentially teach ourselves to tolerate stress by staying in situations of stress and not deregulating that, giving ourselves time to process cortisol out of the system, we can actually adjust to levels of cortisol that become like toxically high, like literally toxic. And so when we think about interacting with like toxic people, this is usually what's going on, that their threshold of cortisol is so high that their like reactivity is like too hair trigger, they become a bit dangerous. They're like really fast to go into a dysregulated state, right? And that becomes problematic and dangerous to the people around them. But we can float a huge amount of cortisol for a long time. And when we do that, that also is going to have a really detrimental kind of acidification impact on our circulatory system, our respiratory system. It's going to increase difficulties in regulating blood sugar. So again, we're like able to look at that top 10 most terrible conditions of the concerns that kill the most people annually in the United States. All are significantly related to floating too high of a level of cortisol all the time. And then our last one in this set, and we'll take a little bit of a pause, is the growth hormone. And growth hormone obviously is present at a really high rate in children and adolescents, but it continues to be present in adults throughout adulthood because we're constantly growing cells, even if we're no longer needing to like expand our bodies into a larger amount of space. Cells are dying and we're replacing them, and we're stimulating and triggering a new generation of cells to emerge into our systems all the time. And so the growth hormone is important in modulating that. And what ties all of these together, growth hormone, cortisol, oxytocin, endocannabinoids, endorphins, dopamine, serotonin, epinephrine, is that they have been measured to regulate whether we're going to do better with bringing them a little up or bringing them a little bit down. All of these hormones are pretty reliably regulating towards a more functional baseline over the course of a massage. And even in 1 hour of looking at serum tests before and after a massage, like unless something really strange is happening, people will reliably improve on all of these chemical markers, even in as short of a 60-minute treatment. And so this is like kind of the secret weapon, right? Like these neurotransmission issues are behind so many of the major health problems, so many of the major behavioral problems, and ultimately those behavioral problems are underlying the like social scale issues that are causing the biggest problems of our planet and our reality right now. And we see predictable improvement through something as simple as massage, through stimulating all those nerve endings, recalibrating everything, giving that sense of comfort, connection, relaxation, parasympathetic nervous system activation. And I want you guys to really like internalize that sense of how predictable and how valuable that adjustment is. On that note, we can take a little pause. We started a little bit late, ran a little bit long, so we'll do a shorter session when we come back in 10 minutes.
Saving the world through massage.
Saving the world through massage. Are you feeling a little inspired by that?
Yes.
Good.